lethal pointer. I'm going to use it instead. This one.
Wow. Is that going to be okay?
You want to sit there?
No. It won't take me that long. Okay. Welcome, everybody. It's very much a pleasure and an honor, really, to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Dave Auston is a Canadian who came down to the South to work, but fortunately for us, to work with us over the last few years. But beyond that, he's had done many things, and I want to, I'll take a little bit of time just to tell you a little bit about his roles that he's played both here at the university and many other places as well. He's currently the executive director of the Institute for Energy Efficiency here at UCSB, and he's also the executive director of the Center for Energy Efficient Materials. And it's really been a dynamic period of time for those of us who've been working in those institutes and working with Dave. Prior to this, he was president of the Kavli Foundation. He was dean of the School of Engineering at Columbia University, provost at Rice University, and president of Case Western Reserve University. And his research was equally spectacular in the breadth and scope of what he has worked on in the fields of lasers, nonlinear optics, solid-state materials, and had considerable industry experience also as a member of the technical staff and a department head at AT&T. So he's got an extremely broad and deep background. So he's going to talk today about something that's very dynamic, which is in keeping with his personality, which is basically the change in energy landscape, which is, you know, both from a global ecosystem point of view and also from what's happening as far as the change in the population and Earth demands on energy requirements are concerned as well. So it's very much a pleasure to have you here, Dave. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you for coming. This talk is, I think it's an experiment, and so I want you to bear with me. I really did it only because I was very confused myself about just where we are headed with regard to energy, not just with respect to the U.S., but also globally. So I set out about a month ago to take a look and drew on a lot of different resources. There's just, as you know, an enormous amount of information out there. Some of it is hyping. You hear, for example, the fact that the energy crisis, what energy crisis? We don't have an energy crisis anymore. Renewables, we don't need those. And there's a lot of just stuff going on. And I wanted to try to work through it, to parse it down, and for my own benefit first, and then hopefully for yours as well, to develop basically a tutorial. So that's what this is. And of necessity, because the topic is so broad, I am going to focus on really two sectors primarily, the generation of electricity and transportation. Those are the two that I'm going to spend most of the time on. But I'll have some introductory information that relates to the bigger picture. So let's get going. First off, just within the U.S., most of you know this, but we are still very dependent on fossil fuels. This is reality, something close to 80%. Renewable energy is really a small part, only 9% of our current energy deployment. And for those of us who are very partial to some of the more developing technologies such as solar and wind, these are really relatively small components of the pie. The biggies, of course, are petroleum, coal, and natural gas. Nuclear, about 8%. And what we want to do is to try to track some of this and see what some of the factors are that will influence how this pie reshapes with respect to technology and with respect to other factors that are taking place. But just for comparison, first of all, here is China. Same pie. Look at this. That's all coal. That blue section is all coal. Any of you, like myself, who've done a fair bit of traveling in Beijing, know how serious this problem is for China and for its people. We are still, now I'm a Canadian, as Galen said. It's a very weak claim these days because I came to this country 50 years ago. But nevertheless, Canadians still do the best. At least they try the hardest on this scale, which is energy per capita. Actually, there are a few countries, smaller United Arab Republics, which are higher, actually off scale in terms of energy use per capita. But we are clearly out front, and even our European compatriots are, a little more than half of what we do. China is well down, and this, of course, was one of the key issues at the Copenhagen meeting, the fact that China argued more for metrics and quotas that would be related to energy use per capita as opposed to total, and the U.S. said no, and that led to a stalemate. There has been some progress, nevertheless. Looking, first of all, at some data which charts energy use in 3 different ways. This is called energy intensity, which is energy per GDP dollar. And that has actually been steadily decreasing, meaning we are much more, our economy is more efficient in terms of its use of energy. Now, part of this, of course, is due to the fact that we've moved offshore a lot of our heavy manufacturing industry, which is the more energy-intensive component of our economy. But even, I don't have the data here, but even if you correct for that, there's still been an improvement in what we call energy intensity. And corresponding, of course, no surprise, but carbon dioxide emissions track that quite closely. Energy use per capita has been pretty flat, actually, for the past 2 decades, which is also important because our population grows by close to 2% a year. So we are actually improving our efficiency in terms of energy use in this country. But this projection, which is based on analysis from the U.S. Department of Energy, they have a division called the Energy Information Administration, which attempts to project where we're headed, is not terribly optimistic. That is some further improvement here, but not a lot. And what we want to do is to take a look at some of the reasons for why this projection is not more optimistic. Here's a breakdown in terms of our use of primary energy, both historical and, again, the projection by the Department of Energy. And I should say, first of all, that this projection and almost all of the data I'm going to show you is based on the assumption that there are no major legislative actions such as a carbon tax or some such thing that would dramatically change the picture. This is sort of this is what they call a techno-economic model. In fact, they're even asking and using that phrase now in some of our grants. So those of you who've and Galen is smiling because we have a new grant with ARPA-E, and they want us to do a techno-economic model of what our science is going to do. By that, it simply means that you combine economic measures with technology evolution and minimal policy issues to try to project where we're headed. And what's interesting here is that there is an increased projection, we'll see why, in terms of natural gas, somewhat less coal, but only slightly less, and this is a big disappointment in terms of this projection. Nuclear, almost the same. Renewables increasing, but not by big leaps and bounds. This is 2040, okay? So we want to try to figure out why is this projection, and this is the U.S. government's projection, okay, because this is the principal voice of the Department of Energy speaking here, not me. If we break it down into the electricity sector, still just for the U.S., we see that things are somewhat different in that, natural gas, yes, it will be deployed more, 5% more. Renewables going from 13 to 16%. Nuclear decreasing this is as a percentage of total electric output. And coal will decrease some in terms of electric generation. Greenhouse gas emissions, as I said I think this is really a repeat of what I've already shown you. Not a lot of change. Pretty flat projection over the next few years. And as we'll see, not enough for even the U.S. to meet its commitment to a 2-degree scenario, which is important. We have the capacity to meet that commitment, but this projection says, which is basically a business as usual projection, says we're not going to do it. Well, what's the first big change that's having an impact on the picture? And you've all heard about this. It goes by the popular name of fracking, which stands for actually a combination of two things, which is very important. That is hydraulic fracturing, which is a technique whereby very deep deposits of oil and gas in not only shale, but in some sand deposits and also in some other rocks, can be extracted through a process of injecting high-pressure fluids containing mostly water, but also some chemicals, which are a key issue, as well as sand to open up the shale and release oil and gas. These depths are enormous compared to what we normally do with conventional drilling. These are down at 5,000 to 10,000 feet underground, way below the conventional sources. And this is basically how it works. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to illustrate a couple of features here. Is that basically the high pressure mixture of water, chemicals, and the chemicals actually, there are a total of some 600 chemicals that are used by various sources in opening up and making certain that the oil and gas flow back to the surface, some of which are not good. You would not want to eat them for lunch. There is also a risk of leakage, which I'll say a few words also about, both of methane and of contamination of groundwater. This is typical water table way up here. This whole process was developed over a period of the last 40 to 50 years. One individual, George Mitchell, whom I happened to interact with when I was at Rice, was largely responsible for developing this. George just died earlier this year. It was also supported quite heavily by the Department of Energy in its early days, and it's now being deployed worldwide. But it's a combination of two things: fracturing, hydraulic fracturing, and also horizontal drilling, some improvements in drilling technology that enabled these very deep wells to go down and then to go horizontally along through these shale and other formations very deep in the surface of the earth. There are numerous such deposits that have been identified. This is a map that was dated 2011, and it's changing all the time. The largest one in the country is the Marcellus. The Barnett Shale, you've probably heard about in Texas, is another one that's very important. Actually, although this looks smaller, the Monterey Shale is actually estimated to have some very substantial deposits of oil, not so much gas, but oil that could be extracted, possibly. The Canadian tar sands up here in the Bakken. And the interesting thing about this is that these are all potentially sources of new oil and gas, and they exist worldwide as well. This is a global map which shows you the distribution. Nature is, pretty kind in this case, although it's interesting that there's very little in the Middle East, which is an important factor. So, I guess it's not their turn. Lots in South America. North Africa, interestingly, a lot, and South Africa, but very little in Central Africa, which is generally very poor nations. China has some, but not a lot. And if we look, for example, of the impact of this new source of oil and gas on the U.S., first of all, what we see is that there'll be a substantial amount of both shale gas and tight gas. Tight gas is a term that's used to apply to gas that is in sand deposits and other rock deposits as opposed to shale. But it's very similar in terms of the way that it's extracted. This is, again, projection by the Department of Energy. It's a business as usual projection. Doesn't say anything about what a carbon tax might do if it were imposed. And there are some potential benefits, but there are also some potential pitfalls which we want to talk about. This is the corresponding picture for oil. Tight oil, again, is oil coming from sand primarily, and some from shale. And a big, significant increase in U.S. production there. A summary, I could show you all the individual countries, but that'd be a little too much data, so I thought it might be better just to indicate what the impact will be. First, the U.S. on the left for gas and for petroleum, oil, as much as 38% in reserves. That's big. 35% in oil, okay? Other countries, other than the U.S., 48% increase in natural gas, and only 10% in oil, which is interesting. And this imbalance is quite, that is, the U.S. is really coming out a winner on this, if that's your perspective, that you see this as a good thing. Here's an interesting picture that shows, what this is the change, anticipated change in dependence on imports. Gas imports on the y-axis, oil imports on the x-axis. The blue are the current positions, and the red are the projected positions, which show, first of all, that the U.S. is potentially going to become a net exporter of natural gas, continues to be a net importer of oil, but much less so. All other countries depicted here will continue to increase their imports, except for Japan, which looks like it'll just hold the same. So that there are substantial geopolitical implications of this, and I've just tried to summarize some for you here. This comes from a group of people I know at the Baker Institute at Rice University. And again, this is all projection. One could argue that this may be overly optimistic, maybe overly pessimistic. But a couple of things are worth pointing out. First of all, the U.S. and China reduced their dependence on Mideast oil, gas. That's quite important. Russia's position also, which is now quite strong with respect to exports of gas, will not fare as well in the future, according to this. And in fact, what's most important is in Europe, especially the non-former Soviet Union countries, China's market share is estimated to drop from currently 27% of that market to half, about 13% in 2040. So politically, clearly that has major implications for Russia's influence in Europe. It'll also affect Iran in terms of their position with respect to exporting their oil resources. It also means that there probably won't be the equivalent of an OPEC, an organization of petroleum exporting countries, for natural gas because it's so widely dispersed. So it's a very interesting geopolitical circumstance. As I said, these are just speculations, but they're based on estimates of where the reserves lie and the ability to get them out at reasonable cost. Now, there's some downside to all of this, which is very important. And the first is that natural gas is primarily methane. And methane, as some of you may know, is a very powerful greenhouse gas. In fact, depending on how you look at it, it's as much as 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So just a little methane leaking into the atmosphere can be extremely bad in terms of the potential for global climate change. And there's been a very interesting analysis done of this in comparing, for example, the scenario that a lot of people are talking about now is basically the question, can natural gas, since it, when burned to produce electricity, for example, produces only half the greenhouse gases as coal, what would happen if we were to replace all, and this is wishful thinking, and I'll show you why in a moment, but suppose we were to replace all 400 to 500 coal-fired power plants in the U.S. with natural gas, convert them to natural gas. How much methane could we afford to leak into the atmosphere and still be ahead of the game with regard to greenhouse gas emissions? The figure that most people agree on now is about 3%, meaning if there's more leakage of methane than that into the atmosphere, you're not doing any better. You're actually making it worse unless you're ahead of the game. So the big question here is, can the folks who are doing all this drilling keep the methane leakage? And it's not just at the wellhead, but it's also in transport to the point of use and actually at the point of use as well to keep that down. And there's a lot of work yet to be done to determine just whether this criterion can be met. And it's not about just meeting at 3%, but keeping well below that. Otherwise, converting from coal to natural gas is not going to help us with regard to greenhouse gas emissions. There are other reasons why we might want to also convert coal to natural gas, and I'll mention those in a moment. The other problem is the potential for groundwater contamination. As I said, the chemicals, I mean, there are a lot of volatile organic compounds used to loosen up the oil and gas that is way down deep in these deposits. And there's a requirement that most states have now that there's a registry where the drilling companies have to list all of the chemicals that they're using. But most not, and it's in effect for most states, but some states, such as my former Texas, have a very cute provision that if there is a proprietary reason to not disclose a chemical, that they don't have to disclose it. And so it's not really working very well. And even then, there's a further challenge with this issue because the question of groundwater, our water supply, is largely a state jurisdiction, not a federal jurisdiction, so that organizations like the EPA and the CDC have limited ability to actually develop and implement regulations that would apply here. So this is, and I give here an example of a recent paper that was just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where some measurements were done around wells, this type of well in Appalachia where the Marcellus Shale is located. And what they found was that the methane leakage into the water table was 6 times higher for homes that were within a kilometer of natural gas wells than those that were outside that range. And of course, methane is the easiest to detect because it's the highest concentration. And the leakage may be occurring here due to the imperfect casings going through the water table. Can also occur because the effluent that comes out here, in addition to the oil and gas that comes out, there's a lot of excess water with all these chemicals in it, and that usually sits in a pond for a period of time before it's processed, and so there's a further problem of potential leakage right through the ground into the water table. So this is an important issue. As yet, it's an open question as to whether one can safely extract oil and gas by this method without seriously affecting the water table. Of course, the oil and gas companies are very confident that they can do this, just as they are very confident that they can keep well below 3% leakage of methane. But both of these, in my opinion, in terms of the reading I did, suggest that a lot more scrutiny and a lot more work needs to be done here before we can draw a clear conclusion about this. So just a couple more things on a global scale here. One of the, and you all know this, but it's really quite dramatic when you look at a chart like this. This is the share of world energy demand, and it's normalized to 100% here, but the actual increase from 2010 to 2035 is 35% total. And what's really important is that almost all of this is in the developing countries. OECD countries, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, is reducing its share of world energy consumption, as is the U.S. China and India, with their voracious appetites and very large populations, are going to have a very big chunk of the energy consumed in the future. And already they do, but it's going to be even greater. And so what they do with regard to, for example, switching from coal to natural gas, introducing more renewables, is even more important than what we in the U.S. decide to do. This is a very interesting measure that there's an organization in Europe called the International Energy Agency. It's kind of the equivalent of our Energy Information Administration. What they're doing here is they're charting as a function of time what they call carbon intensity, which is basically the ratio of carbon dioxide emissions to energy utilized. So that if you are increasing on this scale, you're getting dirtier. You're producing more greenhouse gases per unit energy. We should all be going down on this scale. And unfortunately, I think maybe Europe has been going down a little bit, but not a lot. We've just been sort of cruising along at a constant level. India is increasing dramatically, as is China. And this is a metric that I think has some real value, and unfortunately it doesn't bode well for the future. And for some reason I can't advance. Let's try my computer. It's interesting. What has happened? We stopped dead on this one. Hey, Travis, you want to give me a hand? I don't know. I didn't do anything. No, my computer doesn't work, so it's not advancing either. So I can't even escape. For some reason, it looks like it's locked up all of a sudden. There's a genie in here or something. Maybe a bot that doesn't want me to continue with this talk. It was those comments about China. I'm sure they did it. I may have to reboot here because it looks like it's just frozen. I foolishly installed Mavericks. So those of you who are on Mac know that there was a free. I didn't even know what it was. I thought it was just a regular upgrade. So I said, sure, go ahead and install. And I wish I hadn't done it, and that might be the problem. I think we're going to have to reboot. Yeah.
Do you want to switch to another?
Yeah, I've got actually a good idea. That'll be quicker. Let's do that. Here, I brought a. Nope, that's not it. Here. We're going to switch computers. Yeah, so much for Mavericks. Who knows whether that's the problem, but actually I haven't had any problems with it. It seemed to be working quite fine for the past 2 days. So we're going to switch computers. What I want to do from here is to drill in now on issue of electric generation and also say some things about transportation. Can you see it there? It should be evident. Because there's some very interesting things that are that I want to point out to you that you may not be aware of with regard to, for example, in electric generation. Electricity is now, looks like we're getting there. Okay. Then I won't say what I was going to say. Let's continue from here. I need another clicker. Great. Thank you, Travis. So before we go on to that and talk about transportation and electricity generation in some detail, I just wanted to show you where we are with respect to, and David Lee, I think, is in the audience. He can help me a little bit with this. But this is basically the time chart of global carbon dioxide emissions with respect to the, whoops, what did I do? Okay. Nope. What am I doing, Travis? There we are. Okay. The 6 degree scenario, I'm going to switch to my super, hope I don't burn out anybody's eyes with this, but this is the, yeah, this is a small laser, actually. It's about 10 milliwatts. This is the so-called 6 degree scenario, which is basically the business as usual. This is what's going to happen if we don't. This is the 2 degree scenario down here. No, 4 degree scenario. This is what we need to do to get to a 2 degree scenario. And this is roughly the contributions that various countries have to make to it if you were to go by some of the accords that have been discussed at Kyoto and Copenhagen, for example, meaning the United States has to drop its emissions further by 13%. China, however, has to do so by 33%. And this, of course, was why Copenhagen became such a gridlock. Now, I'm not using this properly. Okay, let's go on and talk about electricity generation. If I can figure out how to advance. Why can't I advance? That's because I'm on the wrong side. There we go. Okay, this is how we generate electricity in the United States today. Coal is by far the single biggest source. As I said, there's about 400 to 500, depending on how you count them, some very small ones, about 400 to 500 coal-fired power plants. Natural gas is next, nuclear, hydroelectric, which is probably not going to change very much going forward, and renewables. The costs are a major consideration. And again, this is data that, first of all, it's a national average. Some of these figures are better for different regions, and I'll show you why. It's fairly straightforward. But this is the current estimate of what it would take, estimates by the Department of Energy, if you were to build a new, for example, geothermal power plant today. Wouldn't come online probably until 2018, and or wind or whatever here. And I've organized these into different groupings. These are the gas-fired, the ones in blue, and what you should be focused on here is something called advanced combined cycle, because that is the competition. And this estimate in terms of cost is based on projections of price and also technology. It assumes that there's not going to be any carbon tax. It's really very competitive. It's much more competitive than advanced coal or even conventional coal. On the other hand, solar photovoltaics, and this is said is a national average. If you were to look at the southeastern United States, it would be less than half this in terms of price, which is competitive. Wind, especially onshore, is in particular areas, is actually now competitive or close to it. Nuclear, because of its very high capital cost, is still, and especially going forward, is going to have a tough time competing with natural gas. Very large capital investments required for nuclear, and I'm going to say something about that in a moment as we go forward. First, solar. This is a chart of the module, that is the guts, not the whole system, but the module. And although it's had some ups and downs, over time, there's been a steady progression of a decrease in cost. And that is almost certainly going to continue. And at some point soon, it should be cost competitive without requiring any subsidies. The discouraging thing, of course, is that while we used to have a lion's share of the market, today we passed that on to China and Taiwan. And it's not likely that we're going to recover a lot of that market share going forward. Solar is, as you know, geographically very, very diverse within the United States. This is actually, if you're thinking of leaving UCSB and going to Harvard or somewhere, you should look at this map, okay? Look at this. The difference between a really high point here and a low point in the Northeast is a factor of 5 in solar irradiance. You'll die. It's just amazing. And the same is true for wind. I mean, the center of the country is where all the wind blows. And I don't know if you were aware of that, but it's really quite significant. About a factor of 2 higher in the center of the country than on either of the coasts. This is one of the major issues with renewables. It's what we call their intermittency, the fact that the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. And what is shown here are 30 days of variation of solar, which is in yellow, wind, which is in blue, and load or demand for electricity, which is in red. And demand it's low in the evening, it peaks up in the morning and then dips down a little in the day, and then when you go home and you want to turn everything on again and watch TV, it peaks up again. And you can see that neither wind nor solar really matches that very well, which is a major issue. And the question, we'll come to this, is one of providing storage. But another very important thing that has happened with regard to electricity is the pricing. Utilities used to buy electricity from sources on a contractual basis, on a monthly or even longer period of time, and it'd be a fixed price. Today, the price varies by the hour. And this is an example. It's an extreme one, but in the eastern Washington, Maryland, Pennsylvania area, May 29, 2012 was an unusually warm period. And shown here is actually the system demand is hard to see, but it's this overall curve that goes like this. And these are the spot prices for electricity from different sources. And this curve over here, the scale is dollars per megawatt hour, which if you divide by 1,000, meaning this is like 60 cents a kilowatt hour, okay, compared to other times. And one of the impacts of this is that those sources of power that are what we call base load, meaning they basically operate at a fixed output, such as nuclear and many coal, can't respond to this. And so they are at a further disadvantage. Natural gas can. Renewables tend to be a constant output also. And this is another reason why natural gas is regarded by the utilities as a favored source of energy going forward. Now, California, as usual, has led the nation, and we have very little coal. Most of our electricity today comes from natural gas. This only further illustrates why natural gas has an advantage. And it's illustrated in detail here. I won't go into this too much because we need to accelerate a little bit on time, having lost some with Mavericks. But what I show here is the ratio of variable to fixed costs of generating electricity. The variable cost, the biggest one, is the cost of fuel. The fixed costs are mostly the capital investment to build the plant, the transmission lines, and other things like that. And you'll see that natural gas with combined cycle, let's see, where is it? Advanced combined cycle. It's in here. Well, conventional combustion. This is all the natural gas in here. Advanced combined cycle. It's mostly variable cost, very little fixed cost. And that gives it a lot of flexibility to play in this market of pricing that varies through the day. A key factor, and that was something when I came across it, I said, whoa, that explains a lot. Also, when you're comparing coal and natural gas, there's an enormous difference in efficiency. This is efficiency plotted horizontally as a percent, meaning the amount of energy out versus the amount of energy in. And combined cycle gas turbines are substantially more efficient than our coal-fired power plants. Just another reason. But perhaps the most important reason for getting rid of coal is air pollution. And it's not just about smoggy days and things of that sort. But coal also coal-fired power plants also emit a lot of carbon particulate matter, micron-sized particles that are very damaging to your lungs and cause a lot of respiratory illness. There's a fair amount of mercury also that's emitted from coal-fired power plants. And what I find is very interesting about this chart is that and this pie chart shows the sources, all sources of air pollution in the United States. Electric generation is fully 49% of those. This is just to further illustrate the point, also to show you that there are massive geographic variations. Each of these yellow dots is a coal-fired power plant, and most of them are in the eastern U.S. In the west, there's very few. Only a very small number in California and the other western states. What the red is the impact on the region, and this is actually, these are mortality figures. The American Lung Association and this organization called the Clean Air Task Force has data that they have compiled which show the number of premature deaths due to respiratory illness coming primarily from carbon particulate matter and other pollutants from coal-fired power plants. And it's quite remarkable. The total is estimated to be as many as 10 to 15,000 people die prematurely in this country each year due to emissions from coal-fired power plants. A very significant reason to be, and I'll jump over this. This is just, the National Academy of Sciences picked up on this, and they converted those mortality figures into dollars, which I don't know whether that makes sense or not, but that's what they did. Some of the NAS studies probably are best not spend too much time on those. Now, what's being done about it? Some of you may have read recently that the President, through the Environmental Protection Agency, has required that new coal-fired power plants will substantially reduce their carbon dioxide emissions. And EPA is basing this ruling on the Clean Air Act, claiming that, which goes back to 1970 with some modifications along the way. It turns out that if this rule is implemented, and there's some questions about whether it will be, because it's actually headed for the Supreme Court right now. There's a lawsuit that has been filed to prevent the EPA from implementing this requirement, and the Supreme Court should hear this quite soon. But if it's implemented, it would require a 39% reduction in emissions from coal-fired plants, and coal cannot do that without introducing carbon capture and storage, and that will increase the cost of coal substantially. It's already not competitive with natural gas. This will take it right off the map. But that's not why the suit has been filed and why it's going to the Supreme Court. The reason for the lawsuit is this, and that is that Obama also wants to impose a limitation on existing power plants, the old ones with, these 400 to 500 that are putting out very large amount of carbon dioxide, and to do so no later than June 2015. This is the reason for the lawsuit. The utilities and others who are fighting this, including some state attorney generals in coal states, don't want this one to be implemented because they think it'll open, it's the camel's nose under the tent with respect to this. And so there's a big uncertainty here. If this EPA measure passes the test, the Supreme Court rules in favor of EPA, then this could basically accelerate, substantially accelerate that transition. But otherwise, it'll be very slow. This just historically to show you, to illustrate further what's happening. This is the additions. This is new power in gigawatts plotted vertically of different types of electric generation. And as you can see, in the past decade or two, almost all of it's been natural gas. That's the orange here. This is the coal. This is coal here. There's a history of coal going way back. Most of the coal power plants that we have now are 40 and 50 years old. They're very rugged, and they almost last forever. And it's very costly to shut them down and build a new natural gas-fired plant. So going forward, you're going to see a whole lot more natural gas and very little coal. So the problem is not about new coal being put in place, at least not in this country. It's about what to do about the existing ones, and that's why that EPA regulation is so important. So carbon capture and storage. The claim in the lawsuit is that this is a technology that hasn't been demonstrated, and so it's not fair to impose it on the utilities. The truth is the utilities have been dragging their feet. They've had lots of opportunity to do this, but there's not today a single utility-scale project of carbon capture and storage. There are quite a few demonstration projects funded largely by the Department of Energy. There are lots of questions about whether this is effective, whether if you put carbon dioxide down into the ground in coal seams, in salt formations, and other places, will it stay there? That's not really well known at this time. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the Supreme Court comes out. I'm not going to tell you how carbon capture works, but I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. This is something that is really disturbing. This is the added capacity globally now for different countries, China, India, the United States. So on this side, positive, are new additions to electric generation by coal, gas, nuclear, and renewables. China's going to obviously to meet the growing demand, 35% estimated over this period of time. China's going to need to make a lot of investments, and it's nice to see a big chunk of them being renewables, but this is a lot. This is 2,000 terawatt hours. That's equivalent to a couple of thousand coal-fired power plants over and above what they already have. And so what we're doing down here is, on a global scale, not going to have a lot of impact, unfortunately. It's important that we do it because we need to, for our own purposes. There's lots of reasons to address this issue of coal. So now let me just summarize this section and then say a few words quickly about transportation. These are some speculative trends that conclusions I've drawn. You may not agree with them, but based on the data and what we see is that it's clear that these new sources of oil and gas are going to have quite an impact, especially natural gas. Renewables are going to compete with this, and I think they will compete well, but it's going to slow down their deployment unless we have something like a carbon tax which levels the playing field. And that would substantially accelerate things. The hope is that this EPA resolution, well, and again, I'm sticking my neck out here and expressing an opinion that's probably a political one, I shouldn't, but if the EPA rule is implemented, then this will clearly accelerate this replacement of coal to gas, and that would be good for a whole lot of reasons. One interesting thing that is happening here, which you may not be aware of, is that the grid is also fragmenting. The role of the traditional utilities, Southern California Edison, PG&E, et cetera, is actually being diminished by the fact that a lot of organizations, especially large corporations, including the University of California, are planning to or have already developed their own what's called energy services unit. Basically, they are buying their own electricity, not from the utilities, but from other sources, and or generating it themselves and becoming their own source of electricity, having their own business units that do that. The very interesting case of the University of California is under discussion right now, and it'll probably be a number of years before anything happens, but it's conceivable that the University of California and its 10 campuses will cut loose from the California utilities and generate and or buy its electricity in the market independent of them. That's going to have quite an impact on a lot of the energy efficiency measures which are funded through the utilities by an increase in our rate of electricity. It's one of the reasons why a lot of these organizations are going their own way, which is not necessarily a good thing. It will probably impact energy efficiency. So let's now jump ahead and talk a little bit about transportation. Yeah, this is a slide I love it. It's one solution, but not the best. You know that the so-called CAFE standards that are being implemented are going to substantially increase. By 2025, we're supposed to be up well over 50 miles per gallon. That's the average light-duty vehicle mileage requirement, okay? Doesn't mean all cars will meet that. It means the average. If you're still driving SUVs or pickups, you probably won't. But if you're driving little cars like me, you probably will. What's interesting is that we have trailed every other major country and will continue to trail them in this regard. I thought, you know, when I first heard about this, when the administration announced this 50+ miles per gallon target, I said, well, we're really setting the standard. No, we're not. Well, you know this. The internal combustion engine is only about 20 to 25% efficient. It's a real dog in terms of efficiency. This is basically, it poses the question, when are hybrids and fully electric vehicles going to be able to compete with internal combustion engines? And depends, of course, on the price of fuel, but also depends on the cost of batteries. And the best guess is that batteries are going to have to improve in terms of cost by about a factor of 2 before we see some really widespread deployment of electric vehicles. And given that battery performance have been improving really only at about 5 to 7% per year for the past couple of decades, that's very challenging. This is an interesting comparison. There's only one car that you can buy that has three possible drive systems. And that's the Civic, the Honda Civic. It's got now a version that's running on compressed natural gas, and there's a lot of hype about this with all this new natural gas. Maybe we should all convert our cars to compressed natural gas and we'll be ahead of the game. Turns out it's not a big advantage. This is the regular gasoline. This is cost to drive a Honda Civic. And as a hybrid, and this again is without subsidies. These are really neck and neck. A little better on the natural gas if you drive a whole lot more miles. But basically the conclusion is that natural gas is probably not going to have a big impact on light-duty vehicles. This just shows you, and again, this is Department of Energy, this is National Academy of Sciences study. Battery electric vehicles are not going to reach par with internal combustion engines in their estimation until 2045, without subsidies, without a carbon tax, okay? That's a long way down the road. Fuel cells might get there sooner, but not a lot. And so, what's going to happen on heavy duty? It turns out that there's already a lot happening. 18-wheelers are rapidly converting to liquid natural gas. And the reason is that on a truck of that size, you have the option and the space and the weight capacity to have a liquefaction, a refrigeration system, basically. And this is happening not only is that, I mean, these stations now exist all over the country. This organization called Clean Energy, which is a source of liquid natural gas, now has a network across the country. And you're going to be seeing, they're already happening. This may spur some light-duty vehicle deployment, but probably not a major issue. A couple of words about batteries storage, which is, in my opinion, if you want to address a technological problem, this is it. This is the single most important technological challenge in clean energy. And this is a joke because this is a company that went bankrupt. A123 it was based on some work out of MIT. They had hopes of making grid-level storage using lithium-ion batteries. It's a fairy tale, unfortunately, because cost is just prohibitive. On the other hand, let me just jump ahead here quickly because I want to show you something really interesting. Just 2 weeks ago in California, the California Public Utilities Commission issued a requirement to the California investor-owned utilities to deploy storage with a total of 1.3 gigawatts by the year 2020, yes. And if you estimate the cost of that, today's prices, this is about $5 to $10 billion, which is going to be piled on your rate, okay? This is the way we do it in California. And the technology just doesn't exist. But this is intended to spur research and development in this area. In parallel with this, there was an announcement by the California Public Utilities Commission. If you don't know about it, you should, because they're providing $162 million a year of new research money for such things as addressing this question and other related electric power needs. Well, let me just go back quickly and tell you also about the biggest single initiative to address this challenge in the world, actually, is something called the Battery Hub. It was awarded last year to Argonne National Lab. I happened to be at a review at DOE just 2 weeks ago of this program, so I had a chance to get a first-hand look at it. They are very optimistic. Their theme is 5, 5, and 5. 5 times improvement in capacity of batteries, 5 times reduction in cost in 5 years. Enormously ambitious. Will they do it? Let's hope so. They've got some interesting ideas. One is to use multivalent ions, such as magnesium 2+ and yttrium 3+, which in principle, if you can work with these materials, should give you 2 and 3 times the capacity as lithium. Also to use some chemical reactions instead of intercalated reactions that are currently used, and to explore flow batteries in much greater detail. These actually probably have the greatest potential for an advance. But they're looking for more than just an 8% improvement per year. And hopefully a breakthrough will come out of this. There's a lot riding on it. They have assembled a very, very capable team of people involving 14 different institutions to work on this. And it's something to watch closely to see where it goes. So just to conclude then, a few comments about where we're headed with transportation. Given the scenarios, absent any major legislation, carbon tax, etc., it appears that hybrid electric vehicles will become more widely deployed, largely driven by the new mileage standards. That will probably, because those mileage standards are also going to increase the cost of internal combustion engines. And so hybrids will become more competitive over time. How long it'll take, it's not clear. It could be a couple of decades, according to the National Academy of Sciences. Liquid natural gas will be used for heavy-duty vehicles. Probably that's going to happen very rapidly and be have a substantial impact. But in terms of light duty, not too much is going to happen. In terms of just cost competitiveness, as I said, I think we've still got some waiting on our hands unless something dramatic happens. such as a carbon tax that would level the playing field. And as I said, the single biggest, let's say this positively, if you were to have a research breakthrough, this is where you should have it in terms of storage, both for transportation, which is so important, but also at the grid level. The California utilities just aren't going to be able to, and we're going to pay for it, of course, as I said, they just aren't going to be able to achieve that goal. And they need to do it because of the parallel requirement that by 2020, which is quite soon, we will have 30% of our electricity generated in California from renewables. And the intermittency at that level poses a major problem. In fact, there are some very interesting calculations that people have done, including those at UCSB, that show that when you get up to that level of intermittency in your electric power generation, the grid can become unstable. And so this is really enormously important. So thank you for your attention. I'll stop there and be happy to take some questions. Yes?
A very simple question. Is the Institute of Energy involved in this last line, the biggest problem that you addressed?
That man right there, and quite a few others. Actually, there's a lot of work at UCSB on energy storage. Yes? Mm-hmm.
I would like to address some of those ideas because
well, if you come see me afterwards, I'll give you the names of some of the people who are working on that. Yeah, sure. Yes, Igor.
So it's interesting to see that on almost every EIA slide, the projections that go from 2020 on are pretty flat and linear. And if you look at the period between 2000 and 2010, there's an enormous amount of fluctuation, for example, in the production of that. I presume that's driven both by the investment cycle, but also by new discovery like, oh, fracking has become really efficient now. Do you have any sort of view of what the fluctuations in the future might bring instead of the linear?
Yeah, and the question, just to repeat it for those of you in the back, is that Igor pointed out that many of the Energy Information Agency, Department of Energy projections show fairly flat and smooth. But if you look at the earlier history, the prior 2 decades, there's substantial variation. One of the key factors there is that there was a recession, a substantial recession that did cause a dip in energy consumption. That's the biggest depression in those curves. But also going forward, as you mentioned, the availability of this new source of fossil fuels, just in terms of, remember, these are, to use their phrase, techno-economic models, okay? The new sources of oil and gas are going to influence the pricing of fossil fuels, probably favorably in most cases. And that also has, I mean, that's flattening these curves out also. It would have been interesting for them to have done these calculations without the new sources of fossil fuels to see what the actual improvements would be, but they haven't done that. Yes, Fred.
Why is it so difficult to retrofit a coal plant to gas power plant?
Oh, it's not difficult. The question was, why is it difficult to outfit a coal plant to a natural gas plant? It just costs money, that's all. And the utilities are reluctant to spend money on it. Yeah, I mean, they were reluctant to spend money on carbon capture and storage, and they've done very little in that regard. I mean, again, I should be careful about what I say. It's difficult to hold back on these topics. But basically, it's cost. It's just cost. It's a competitive market. Remember that utilities used to have something of a regional monopoly. That's no longer the case. Electricity is bought and sold all over the country these days. I mean, you pay more if you have to transmit it all the way across the country, but the market has changed dramatically in that regard. And with this pricing that I pointed out on a daily basis. It's just extremely competitive. And so the utilities are much more cost conscious than ever before. Yeah. David?
I was surprised that the cost of solar is about 15 cents a kilowatt hour. Can you say a little bit about the trends in that, how that
David's question is why is the cost of solar PV 15 cents a kilowatt hour? That's a national average, okay? That applies to the folks in New Jersey as well as the folks in Bakersfield. And as I showed you, I mean, clearly the cost is proportional to, inversely proportional to irradiance, okay? And as I showed you, the irradiance varies by a factor of almost 10 from different parts to different parts of the country. So solar, especially in the southeastern desert regions, is actually quite close now to being economical at the utility scale, especially solar PV. Solar thermal is a different matter. And there are some very large solar thermal installations that are being deployed now at the many hundreds of megawatt level. And it'll be interesting to see how they do. But solar at the utility scale is approaching substantial competitive cost. It's not there yet, but the predictions are within another 5 years. The challenge is it's not just the cost of the silicon and the solar device itself. It's what they call the rest of the system, the fact that you have to mount it, you have to have some tracking to get the highest efficiency. There's the cost of the land. There's a whole lot of other costs. And so those tend to be harder to bring down. There have been a lot of improvements there. The sort of learning curve that we have in most semiconductor technologies that, Moore's law is, doubling every 18 months. Silicon solar cells are following a good learning curve, but it's these other costs that are becoming much more important. The module, so-called the silicon module, is becoming a smaller fraction of the total cost, and that's why things are leveling off now. Right. I hope you all heard the question. The question was to comment on the role of the utilities in encouraging and or discouraging small individual generation, non-utility generation. And we've had some discussions through the Institute for Energy Efficiency with the utilities on this matter. In fact, Jen McGannon, who's here somewhere in the audience, and actually, by the way, I want to thank Jen for critically reading this, and also Claire Dooley, who's here, who helped me prepare the slides. They were enormously helpful, both of them. And utilities actually are kind of a mixed mind about this. They are, I think, encouraging it, but at the same time, there's been a lot of I would say, conflict about feed-in tariffs, that is, what the appropriate price should be for an independent operator to feed electricity excess electricity that they do not need into the grid. The other factor that I touched on in my talk is that a lot of the energy efficiency measures and even some of the research funding is done through the utilities. It's done, well, California Public Utility Commission requires it, such as, for example, when you buy a refrigerator and you get a rebate if you buy a more energy efficient refrigerator, that money comes from the utilities, which passes it along to us, of course, as electric customers. And that's a whole process that's been very successful in California in terms of, if you look at, I didn't show it, but many of you, of course, have seen the amount of electricity used in California has been flat for about 3 decades. And it's largely because of these energy efficiency measures that the utilities implemented. And so there's a reticence on their part to, go to a fragmented system because the independent operators are not a part of that energy efficiency program. And they have consequently a cost advantage. And these issues haven't really been fully worked out. As the big corporations start, including UC, start to possibly develop their own sources of electric energy and maybe even gas, although that's more difficult to do, this is going to pose a real big question for not just the state of California, but other states. We just happen to be ahead of the curve on this one. But it is a very, very interesting question that's at this time unresolved. Tom?
Just as a follow-up on that, you show that the utilities have to pay a lot more in the middle of the day than they do at night.
No, those are the customers. That's the charge. The utilities charge their customers. Yes. That's not the cost of their producing the electricity. That's what they're able to charge in that market because the demand is so high.
They're charging Southern California Edison, as I understood what you said.
Oh, no. Let me go back to that. This is an interesting point. Let's be sure we are clear on what's happening here because it's a very interesting issue. This one. No, what this graph shows is the pricing of electricity, okay? These are utilities. These companies are utilities, okay? And so different cities and other organizations are buying from, and other customers, corporations, individuals are buying from these utilities. This is the price the utilities are charging in this high demand market.
Do you know what Southern California Edison is charging here? Does it go up that badly?
No, because we have what's called a demand response energy saving program, and that we have an arrangement with Southern California Edison that when demand increases, we will reduce our utilization of electricity in return for a very favorable fixed rate. And so, and a lot of organizations, it's another problem a complication if the University of California were to go off and become its own provider of electricity. We would no longer have that provision.
My point really is this. Walter Cohn has solar on his house. I have solar on my house.
Right.
And Southern California Edison gives us if you go on time of use metering, they
Yes.
give a very small reduction
Right.
in cost.
Yes.
But if you generate energy in the middle of the day, you actually win some.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The difference is
But not that much. That's right.
If they would make the difference much bigger,
Yes.
they would get more people to put solar on their house and reduce what they have to buy.
Good point. Yep, good point. Which I think speaks to the question asked by the person in the back about whether the utilities are really ambivalent about this. Clearly, traditionally they have controlled electricity, and the future looks very different.
Actually, the demand curve is shifting towards the PM hours, as a matter of fact. I don't know, even though it is...
The demand curve, unfortunately, didn't show up. It's up here. The demand curve is actually quite smooth.
But it's still, the peak is shifting towards the after sundown rather than being in the middle of the day. So,
Yes, which is typical. As I showed earlier, electric demand peaks early in the day and late in the day. Yeah, and those figures are annual. You have to also look at the variation through the year, especially if you live way up in the Northeast, right? You don't get that much sunshine. Okay, shall we? Galen, you're in charge here. What do you want to do? Okay.